Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 41, Official Negotiations. Naruto had only been to Mizunokuni a few times before, and never in a friendly way. It was similarly difficult putting together a routine familiar with their eastern cousins. A Byakugan user was a must. Konoha had learned not to fight Kiri in their own midst without some kind of long-range detector. Naruto was a decent sensor, but he was no natural. Having Byakugan Hyuga along allowed him to focus on other matters, such as what he was going to say to the Mizukage. He remembered their last conversation at the Taki Chunin exams and the way she so naturally seemed to fit in that chair. She was confident, cunning, and wasn't above a bit of light manipulation. But back then he was Nakage. They should be on equal footing now in that regard, although whether or not she would see it that way remained to be seen. He was the younger Kage in both age and tenure, but the latter was only by a few months. She may have lived through and won a civil war, but Naruto wasn't bereft of experience either, and he had one of the wisest advisors he could ask for in Hiruzen, even if the older man wasn't with him now. Already, the power games were in full effect as Naruto and his party were forced to wait at the very outskirts of the village to be escorted in. He knew the Kirinin were aware of his presence. Byakugan had conferred they were being watched towards the edge of his Diojutsu range. They stayed there in the damp of the waterlogged forest for about 20 minutes before a small entourage of Kirijonin arrived to escort them forward, enough to try their patience, but not enough to convey offense. Nearly textbook, Hiruzen would have likely thought of several ways to turn this on its head by now, but Naruto wasn't Hiruzen. He was more than willing to wait out these little games. He was the visitor here, as already he was in the weaker negotiation position. Whether May had to do what had to do to reinforce her confidence was fine with him. His main advantage was that she had no idea why he was here, and the fact that she had been perhaps a little too hasty in accepting his offer to talk. That eagerness was telling. Kirigakure was a beautiful village. What it lacked in Konoha's bustling rustic charm, it made up for in elegant, twisting architecture done in a white, almost metallic stone that shone in the condensation clinging to the walls. It also seemed more planned than Konoha's sometimes random street designs, more like an extended military base instead of the almost organic growth his own village had underwent. Although on that point he figured that Hiruzen might have been a bit too secure in the idea that other villagers couldn't cotton on to Konoha's success. The signs of the recent civil war were still evident around him, in the hasty patched buildings and the more recent additions that didn't quite match the traditional aesthetic. The village was beginning to show some of that patchwork beauty that would have been so intensely familiar to any Leafnin. Likewise, he could see the bustle of activity for both shinobi and civilians alike intermittently. Mei Terumi wasn't the proud type then. Above learning from her rivals, that was useful to know. The Mizukage building was impressive in its own right, as scorching as it was by, if the bingo books were accurate about Terumi's building's lava. It may have passed for some kind of arena from the outside, if not for the many adequate sprouting off its circular form and spreading out from the village like a system of stony veins. The waterways were also apparently used so as some kind of converted highway system, as he and his routine were led right up one, using paths built on either side of the water flow and straight into the heart of the buildings. Based on the aesthetic of the village, he might have expected a very Spartan, bare stone sort of effect inside. Instead, everything was rather lavishly decorated with pastel colors, worn tapestries, and rich imported woods that banished any thoughts of the dreary weather outside. Even if the Yonde Mizukage was a genocidal madman who threw his entire country into the bloodiest period in shinobi history since the clan wars, he had a wonderful taste in decorations. This time, the Mizukage eschewed any more mind games, and they had him come right in, minus his entourage. That was fine, though they had their own orders, and it wasn't as though even with his entourage around, they stood a much better chance of surviving aggressive action. That large window that dominated one of the offices was done in such a way that it cast the light streaming through the mist outside into an entrance rainbow pattern that danced across the walls distinctively. Sitting there in her plush, high-backed chair with all the elegance of a true leader, made Hirumi manage to look even more beautiful than he remembered, although that it may have been a few extra inches of skin on display. This is a woman who played for keeps. Why, Hokage Dono, she started, however, making some first few words dripped with a primal magnetism. I might admit that it was an unexpected pleasure to hear you would come calling. Naruto pulled together all of his training to keep a comfortable but non-divertible smile on his face as he settled into the decidedly less comfortable chair opposite her desk. The two of us partaking in such a private sojourn together. My, the Kage must be scandalized. Should they be should they be Mizukage Dono? Naruto shot back easily, silently reminding himself over and over that he was the Hokage. After all, these are just friendly talks, are they not? May somehow turned the slight quirk of a lip into a sultry expression Uncle would have killed to mimic. Oh, of course. She leaned forward slightly, accentuating the depth of her neckline. But you see, it's all about appearances with them. They likely balk at the idea. She drew herself in slightly, as if remiss to even speak it out loud. What we might do together, not to lean forward as well, humouring her, such as. At that, the airborne-haired woman leaned back with practical nonchalance. Oh, trade on non-policies, armado pacts, truces. She dropped her eyelids a fraction of an inch. Alliances. Again, Nato humoured the idea, waving his hand as if weighing some invisible scale. Well, such a block would be for some. They would have every right to be worried. He let that thought hover for a moment before adding, even if the idea is far-fetched. The Mizukage smile didn't waver. Of course, they continued in his wager for a good few minutes, lightly trading veiled barbs and tacit arguments. All the actual negotiations was in the realm of the implied, nothing said outright, as was only proper of the leaders of ninja, but those arguments were no less ironclad and enforceable as the most legible infused concords between daimyo. It was all fairly simple stuff to begin with, the usual trade agreements and non-operation pacts that were always ignored with the implicit understanding that the other side would ignore them too. The dialogue would only took a turn when Naruto slightly slipped in the subject of forward Mizukage on his prior status, even if you must admit that Kirigakure, despite their many accomplishments and well-deserved fame, are not well known for their funjutsu, save for, of course, what they plundered from the Uzugakure along with Kumo and Iwam. But that was a different generation, and Naruto held no grudge for the woman in front of him. Or perhaps, Hokage Dono, you raised the bar too high on yourself. Your family's predilection for the art is well known. Kiri has managed just fine in the past with our Jinchuriki. On that, they knew both. She was lying through her teeth, although they were very dignified purely teeth, and the lies slithered through as opposed to being forced. The Jinchuriki of the Rokubi had been AWOL for years now, even bare of the Civil War, and Naruto had a stack of damage reports on his desk back home at resting to the freedom of the Sanbin. May seem to catch on to this when Naruto made no move to push the subject. The Biju have always been a delicate subject around here, especially given the status of our former leader. The may he rot in hell went unsaid in this case. I can assure you that straightened efforts are being made to keep the situation domestic. Naruto smiled. I thought in that regard Konoha might be able to lend some aid. For hefty concession, I might imagine. May returned without missing a beat. The redhead just waved the hand airily. The Biju are every nation's concerns. The damage they can wreak, if even accidentally, is monstrous. There was something wonderful in what was unspoken. The thought that Konoha might be willing to do an actual favor for another nation, not the typical "you owe me" favor either. You would certainly consider such aid, May said after a lengthy pause, the biggest concession she had made to letting something genuine slip through her tightly controlled facade. As for now, I would be thrilled if you accepted Kirikakure's hospitality for the evening. I would personally recommend the sushi roll on the main street. Perhaps we might even share a bit together sometime. Naruto knew it was still part of the game, that it wasn't really him and May speaking, but the Hokage and the Mizukage. How could I refuse? The subtleties only ended when they both stood, somehow leaving their leaving their personas in their chairs as they shared their first genuine appraisal of one another in those terse few moments. Finally, May cracked a smile, more genuine than the 10 times more radiant than any the Mizukage could manage. I must say, you have played havoc with my expectations of you. The redhead nodded at the implied request. I feel we've said enough to call me Naruto. Naruto! She seemed to taste the word for the time, apparently enjoying it by the smirk of her lips. Then I would be remiss if I didn't offer the same courtesy. The offer seemed a whole lot less layered than it did during the tuning exams, and Naruto felt a lot more comfortable accepting. Then I can say the same for you, May. It was as though a hundred hands said things were passed between them in that moment, a mutual understanding, not so much between themselves as it were between leaders. We're both young leaders. Her eyes flittered to the corner of the room where Naruto knew Ayu had been hidden from the entirety of the negotiations, and we face more mounting pressure on all sides. It is pleasant to know that there is a direction we might lean. Naruto didn't say anything, just extending his hand for a shake. The negotiations were far from over, but he felt the better part of the groundwork had been laid for something more solid when she accepted his hand, a rare gesture in the world of shinobi, when there was the implicit understanding that they would probably kill one another with less contact. He allowed a few teeth to show in his smile. The sushi, was it? Naruto found himself rather fond of the accommodation he and his party had been put in. He could barely see the thick white stone the building was made of through the various plush furnishings that gave the hotel room a soft, uncomfortable atmosphere. He didn't dwell on it long, though, before doing the mandatory check for surveillance seals and any listening-ins. He found a few, but that was to be expected as a foreign dignitary. They became redundant all the same when he placed down a pre-prepared seal that mimicked the one permeated seat in the Hokage's office, a clever construction of the Ninden. It didn't so much block sounds leaving the room as it did distort them. Likewise, it made any image inside the confines of the room fuzzy, for lack of a better word. It was excellent for disguises, hand signals, or anybody who might be watching in. When he was sure he was secure for the moment, he tossed the Hiraishinkuna into the center of the room. A moment later, and with a yellow flash that was almost nostalgic, 4 people appeared in the room. 3 of them vanished almost as soon as they appeared, taking Byakuya with them and leaving a perfect doppelganger in his place. Komachi had been chosen to be dropped off by the Yondaim's old bodyguard because of her rather excellent henge, one of the best in Abu. Rather nice place, isn't it? Naruto asked, just in case Kiri had some other method of listening in. The real conversation was happening in subtle hand signals. Status report. The doesn't quite compare to home. They can only hope to emulate the quiet dignity of the Hyuga compound. Target moving up the coast. East ETA 7 minutes. Yes, well, I imagine that familiarity would have the residents here say otherwise. Good. Rendezvous with surveillance team and await further instructions. Komachi sniffed happily, and if Naruto didn't know any better, he would have said she was enjoying the ruse. They can believe what they like, I suppose. Just because they finally wrapped up the barbaric civil war doesn't mean they can start pretending otherwise. Orders understood. Additional note, possible code sunrise. Naruto had to quickly suppress a frown. Akatsuki could be trouble. By all their intelligence, it was too early for them to be making a move. Had something changed? Were the guests here? And I have to admit, the place has its own charm. Continue as normal. Do not engage. Dismissed. Komachi sniffed again, imitating the typical Hyuga pride with practical ease. Before she could even lower her nose, she was gone and replaced again by the real Byakuya. You should see it to your own room, Byakuya. I intend to sample Kiri's hospitality for at least the night. The real Hyuga nodded impassively, acknowledging the true order to scout the area as much as possible. Of course, Hokage-sama. Alone again, Naruto walked over to a nearby window, hiding his thoughts behind a veneer of curiosity at the mist that swept the panorama that sprawled out beneath him. It was a wonderful view, but the young Hokage had little time to appreciate it as he considered the new information. The fact that Akatsuki might interfere was concerning, but Naruto wasn't afraid of them, especially since dealing with Kisame. but in that instance he could count on Itachi in staying out of the fight. To S-Class, missing Nin would be a tougher pill to swallow, especially if it was the pair who had tried to kidnap Fu. Still, if things went according to plan, he was only made to wait 10 minutes before there was a knock at the door. He wasn't surprised. He had thought they would send somebody to check up on him after whatever surveillance seemed to have failed. What was surprising was finding the Mizukage herself outside his door, looking a great deal less official without her wide-brimmed hat. "How are you finding the accommodations?" It wasn't hard to switch out the surprise on his face with bemusement. The small breach in protocol was promising, pleasant, if missing the comfort of homes. May somehow made her amusement as sultry as if she had simply walked into the room already shedding her clothes. "Oh, I can imagine. From what I've heard, you're quite the family man." Technically, news of Uncle's pregnancy wasn't supposed to leave the village, but it wouldn't be naive to expect the other Kage not to know something like that. The fact that May chose to bring it up, though, it was acknowledging that aspect of their game was shelved. I was particularly interested in the seals on the windows. I assumed to keep them water repellent. He wasn't. He knew they were likely spoils from the fall of Uzukigakure, but he was keen to switch topics. "Shouldn't I be the one asking you? One of the youngest steel masters in history is certainly one of your more impressive titles." The redhead's lips quirked. Seals. Seals were comfortable. Seals he could talk about for hours. The funny thing about Fujitsu is that no matter how much you think you know, there's always more. Not unlike any field of study, then, May added, pouring herself a drink from the decanter that had been left in the room. Neither had yet to touch it. Probably wouldn't have if she hadn't demonstrated its safety. Another calculated show of trust. The woman was certainly working towards something. Unfortunately, Fujitsu has always been a limited aspect of Kiri's past in favor of more martial pursuits, and the difficulty of the last few years has only warned the situation. So that was how she was choosing the phrase "the Civil War." A difficulty, in others' words, tacitly stating their weakness without suggesting the village had lost its bite. "I'm sure what we may call seal masters would barely register as dabbers in the art to somebody like you." You could tell she was skittering around the subject and deciding to push it a little. A metaphorical deficit in supply, then? That seemed to stop the older woman for a moment, but she caught herself brilliantly, giving a non-comical wave. "Perhaps more of an over-demand for the moment." "Well, then, I would be a poor leader if I didn't point out that Konoha might be in a position to weigh in on the matter." "Oh, why then, they would then? How very forward." May pushed her chest out slightly, but it was mostly empty play. She had clearly given up on trying to use that approach in her negotiations. "And what would be your counteroffer in this metaphorical matter?" "Well, on something as nebulous as Fujitsu, that could vary a great deal, but that's what negotiations are for, unless the matter was time sensitive." He could almost see the woman's eyes harden slightly, some of the pretenses slipping away as he made his position as clear as he could be in the silky trappings of the shinobi talk. "If you choose to go this way, a high price will be exacted." May moved back, gliding across the room to lean against the nearby armrest. She had made a show of examining the room as she considered it. Naruto chose that moment to drop in the caveat. "Of course, Konoha has always been kind to her allies. The leaf is easier to forge closer allies with those she calls friends." His meaning was once again crystal clear. There might be a steep step, but if you need friends, and Konoha is the best you could make. He could see the gears grinding away behind those pale green eyes. He couldn't predict the outcome, as he still hadn't made a proper read on the wily Mizukage. He could, however, bank on what he didn't know. Kurigakure was recovering, and by the looks of it, undergoing extensive remodeling in the wake of their recent difficulty. It also looked as though May had chosen Konoha as the image to rebuild her village in. If the ideology ran stronger than a simple strategic move, there was something to work with there. Eventually, he could see she had come to the decision. "Would you care to take a walk with me, Naruto?" Naruto recognized that look all too well, and for the first time realized that he wasn't the only leader who agonized over their decisions, even after they were made. It depends if we're walking towards a certain biju. If May was surprised by the bluntness of his questions, she didn't let it slip, apparently recognizing herself to her choice as she let her shoulders and gave a quiet smile. Must you ruin the surprise? The efficiency with which the small coastal village had been evacuated was commendable. Clearly, it wasn't just the shinobi of Mizuno Kuni that had gotten good at dealing with sudden attacks during the Civil War. It was a good thing too. Even from the steep side a few hundred meters from the village, while Naruto could see the damage was extensive, most of the buildings and structures near the water were little better than kindling. The rest had been compromised by the floodwaters and reducing the soil to a soppy muck. That dominated the vista, though, was the enormous creature thrashing wildly just off the shore. So currently, it was being hurried by a group of Kirinin. If harassed was even the right word, mildly irritated might have done the scene better. Justice as water jutsu that would have easily drilled through the solid rock, splashed harmlessly against the zombie's enormous shell, simply turning into a place, caused great swells of water that threatened to level the rest of the incredulously starry-looking village. Quite a sight, Naruto muttered, already repressing images of a different night 15 years ago. The zombie couldn't compare to the sheer malice or suffocating power of the QB, but it was still a Biju. Oh, I'd hope never to witness again if I'm allowed a rare moment of honesty, May admitted, reminding Naruto that she had been the one to take down Yagura and had likely faced the beast before. His respect of her abilities to Kunoichi rose a few notches. Any advice before we start? May just motioned to the ongoing fight that was happening below, pointing out a Kiryambu that had been slapped aside by one of the beast's great scaled tails and sent skidding across the water like some over large skipping stone. Mind the tails. Naruto allowed him one large grin at the flippancy she could manage in the face of such overwhelming power, but setting his face into what Ame had taken to calling Hokage mode, he threw Hiraishin Kunai into the dirt at his feet, and in 3 quick flashes, a small team of Anbu had been dropped off in front of them. His father had been on to something when he granted a select few people the ability to perform the Hiraishin as a group. He would have to think on refining the process later. For now, Taka, north, Buta, east, Saru, west, Inu, south. He handed them each a large scroll which twice the size of the normal sealing variety. Sit up and begin connecting. Don't attempt to complete the seal until I've set the foci. When he received the 4 professional nods, he waved them off, quickly pulsing his chakra to signal another drop-off. Instantly, Tenso was in front of him, and Naruto could practically feel the grimace beneath the man's mask. You know what to do. Heard. Don't restrain. Asking the fleshly Mokuton user to restrain the 3 tails would have been a bit much, but the man could certainly keep it in place long enough for the others to get in position. He seemed to shore himself up a bit before nodding and flickering off to join the others. Naruto glanced across at Main, only to find the woman staring at him with a calculating gaze. It's almost as though you had planned for this, Hokage Dono. The redhead shrugged. His mind was already half taken by the various on-the-fly calculations he was making. It pays to be prepared in our profession, and, as I said, the Biju are every nation's concern. May simply hummed, glancing back down to where the Konoha Anbu were beginning to take up their positions among their mist counterparts. I will inform my shinobi not to interfere and protect your men if possible. You understand if I won't have them throw away their lives, though? I wouldn't ask the same. Naruto acknowledged, running through a few lightning quick hand seals. A moment later, an enormous scroll, perhaps a little smaller than a summoning scroll, appeared in his hands. He slung it over his back. It was the keystone of this entire operation, and carefully measured his shot before throwing a single kunai as hard as he could towards the beast. Dropping his mask for a single instant, long enough to wink at the Mitsukage, he said, "See you on the other side," before vanishing in a flash of red. What a curious man, May mused before dashing off at her own pace. Her Anbu would need all the help they could get to keep keeping the zombie in one position. She knew from experience. Komachi cursed her luck as she faced down the fury-filled glare of the zombie. The enormous beast seemed to have taken a rather personal interest in crushing her flat as it once again flailed its tails. It didn't help that every turn of its body caused the water to roil and bubble as waves bigger than she was attempting to fling her back onto land. All of this might have been manageable if it didn't also feel like her lungs had been filled with boiling lead and her arms weighed down by anchors. The Biju's presence was just oppressive. No easier way to say it. Its hatred was like a physical waves that were radiated out and rolled over her in thick, hot pulses that threatened to have her legs turn and run with no input from her brain. All of this, and she had to focus on the complicated seal floating on the water in front of her, because if she didn't, all of this would have been for nothing. Her own solace was that the other three Ambu across the cardinal directions were also feeling this, and they hadn't wavered either. She caught a red flash appearing way up on the zombie shell and felt a little of the smothering malice lift as the Bijuri focused on the new nuisance, riding it like the world's largest rodeo. Komachi could almost smile behind her mask as she saw her Hokage give her a cheeky wave from atop the beast before hastily rolling to the side to avoid one of its created tails. Chitin tails. She knew he would be busy for the next few moments, placing the anchor seals that would ensure all of this worked. How he could stand to be that close to the beast that was beyond her. The fact it looked as though he was having a great time ducking and weaving across its shells was mind-boggling. Kage were crazy, the lot of them, and as if to prove her right, the Mizukage suddenly slammed into the side of the beast like a meteor, shrouded in a pale mist that caused the Biju to give a deafening shriek of pain and anger. The pale mist that caused the Biju to give the Ambu, Kiri, and Konoha alike could only watch in wonder as the mist visibly ate into the shell that their most powerful Jujutsu could barely scratch. Not to be outdone, and ever the competitive spirit, not to trust that moment when the Sunbeam focused all of its attention on Mei and made it regret it. He suddenly appeared before the creature's face, holding a Rasengan bigger than its eyes before flashing away. There for less time than it took to blink. The moment the jutsu was bereft of its creator, it expanded rapidly, engulfing the beast's head in a shrieking, grinding sphere of chaotic energy that saw its bulky tail fall limp behind it. Stunned, Naruto chose that moment to appear beside her, nearly causing her to lose focus. She should have gotten used to such display back in Ambu, but it was easier said than done. The anchors are set. Get ready to begin the sealing, he said, face stony just with the spark of adrenaline alight behind his eyes. I think the Mizukage will help me keep it distracted, but I'm not counting on it. I'm going to rely on the others to start closing the trap, so things are going to get rough, but she never got to hear what he would say next, as he suddenly threw himself in front of her, taking the brunt of an explosion that appeared out of nowhere. When the tiny whine in her ears finally subsided, the Ambu mask helped in that regard. It was replaced by the beating of enormous wings. Don't get what all the fuss is all about. He wasn't that tough. You sure that was the same guy who took out Kisame? She peered up through the clearing smoke at the two silhouettes bickering atop an enormous white beard, one tall and lanky, the other squat and hunched over, both wearing the recognizable red cloaks of the Akatsuki. Don't be so complacent. He may have been young, but he is the Hokage nonetheless. Your worthless art won't have taken him out of the fight so easily, and we still have a job to do here. Komochi tried not to panic. The Ambu had been briefed about the Akatsuki and their known or suspicious members. Yeah, time is money and all that. It's a good thing my art works just as well in a flash. Then again, she never thought she might be facing any of them, especially one that could catch Naruto off guard. That's Kakazu, you fool. I simply don't wish to keep Leader-sama waiting, so hurry up and deal with the trash while I see to the beast. The Ambu took a calming breath, regaining herself to what would likely be a last stand, making sure the ceiling went uninterrupted. She let out a sigh of relief when nobody else stepped up in front of her. I'm afraid you have more pressing concerns. Akatsuki no Asasori, Akasuna no Satori, may stated calmly. Her eyes are carrying about the violent waves and the pain roars of the sunbeam. And the woman turned slowly to the lanky blonde. Whoever you are. Komachi wondered if it was a trail all Kage shared to make their subordinates feel just as safe and secure as if they were back home in the training field. She almost wanted to grin at the irritated expression the other S-rank Noonkin wore as he stomped his foot angrily atop the strange, lumpy bird. It's Deidara, yeah, learn it. Your sorry excuse for a Mizukage. I want to introduce this one to my art, Satsuri Dana. The hunched over missing Nin grunted irritably, saying, You have your orders. Go, I'll deal with the woman. Before hopping down off the bird to stand across from the Mizukage on the turbulent waters, Deidara clearly looked pained for a moment before scrawling and directing the bird to fly off in the direction of the other Ambu. Komachi wondered what she was supposed to do. She was right next to a potential fight between S ranks. Her teammates were in trouble from another, and they were all still in the middle of a Binju ceiling. And where the hell was Naruto. End of chapter 41.